So my next guest is Peter Thomas. Peter is the managing director of PMC, the well-known speaker company. Peter, welcome.
Hello, Simon. Nice to talk to you.
And thank you very, very much for participating today. Now, the one reason I was really keen to get you involved is you must be the man with the largest record collection I know. How many LPs have you got?
More than one. I have never really counted them, but it's quite a few thousand. I think probably about 4,000 or 5,000 albums. Same amount of 78s, because I love 78s as well, which is strange for somebody into audio because obviously the quality is not quite as good. And they're probably about 4,000 45s as well.
Gosh, wow. And the 78s, now that's interesting. So do you have a particular special turntables that you play those on to A, not wreck your stylus, or B, get the best out of them?
I do, yeah. I have an old an old SME and a Garrard 401 to play the 78s on. And I have about 6 different size styli. So I can cope with all the different variations. What's remarkable about them really is actually the sound quality when you play them well is not bad actually. They recorded very well, direct to disc, most of them. So they're pretty lively. You've got that sort of, I love blues and jazz, so you get that passion and that liveliness from the direct cut.
Yeah, no, fantastic. In fact, and in some of the testing tracks that we use, tuning kit, I often use some of those older recordings because that's a real test, isn't it, of is the passion of the music coming through rather than just the mucking about with the recording quality.
Yes, I think so. It's a weird situation really that the poorer the quality, sometimes it makes you focus on how well you're reproducing whatever the recording is. And we often use at PMC different recordings that aren't actually that good because, when you play a really good recording on a system, often it'll sound good on anything. Even if you play a Dansette record player, it still sounds great. It's one of those recordings where, they just sound brilliant on everything. So sometimes it's good to have recordings like that are, that are not A1, but they reveal a lot about your system.
Yeah, no, exactly. Now, what got you into vinyl in the very first place? What was your first step on your 4,000 or 5,000 collection ladder?
I suppose, I had a much older brother and sister. They were about 10, 15 years older than me, the two. And they used to bring home loads of 45s throughout the early 60s. So I got to know them very well, and I got to know all the B-sides because they would used to stack them on these big auto changers, turn the 10 records over and play the other sides, which is kind of criminal from our point of view now because they all used to skid as they landed on each other. But I got to know that music really well. I think there was that, and of course the other thing was my grandfather gave me a wind-up gramophone when I was about 8. And a big pile of 78s, which I think probably that's what started me on the path to listening to that music. And I was kind of always fascinated by this wind-up gramophone, how sound came out of it, not plugged into the electricity, and it sounded great, So I think those two things that got me into discs, I suppose, is the best way to describe it. And I've obviously got more interested in vinyl as I got older because of the sound quality, and of course stereo through the 60s gradually developed, and that was, back then that was quite a fantastic leap, a bit like, probably more even than 5.1 is and Dolby Atmos is today. It was quite a big jump to go to stereo. That was remarkable.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I remember my father had all of the original Beatles albums in mono because they all came out mono, and then suddenly he brought home a stereo version. I think it was Revolver was the first one. It might have been Rubber Soul. And I think it was Revolver was the first one that was naturally recorded in stereo.
Yeah.
And completely different. Completely. Suddenly there's a soundstage which you've never heard before, which was an amazing experience.
But of course, back in those days, it was always a bit of a lash up. A lot of the turntables or record players, as they were then, often had a stereo output on them, and you could plug in a tape recorder and use the tape recorder as the other channel, or a separate little box you could buy as an add-on. So it was all a bit of a lash up for most people for stereo. But and I guess that's why those stereo recordings were so stereo, ping pong stereo, because it then showed off how how good the stereo was in the cars.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so you're clearly now displaying your technical capabilities because you are obviously by trade an engineer, having been one of the very early guys at the BBC. Do you want to just give us a little brief synopsis of what you were doing there in your early days?
Yeah, personally, I feel I joined it at a wonderful time. The BBC had got an incredible amount of income coming in because the colour TV licence started to pay off in the 70s, and I joined in 78. And suddenly a lot of money was made available to BBC Radio. BBC Radio was always sort of like second to TV back in those days. And suddenly we were working on, I joined the BBC as an engineer looking after studio equipment. Remarkable place. They gave you 6 months intensive training on everything from microphones, all the different types of microphones, how to repair them, how to design them, all the way through to the recording desks, to the tape machines, what they worked, all the theory and how to repair and calibrate them. Same with turntables, loudspeakers, obviously. Everything, all the way through to the transmitters and the tuner, the FM tuner in your home, listening in stereo. So you had this wonderful picture of the whole of the audio chain. And so we worked in studios, and that's what I joined as. And over a period of about 3 years after I joined, we moved from all these really old valve studios that have been there since the 1930s, all the way into computer-controlled desks. So an incredible amount of change. I mean, the BBC had sort of several hundred studios in central London at that time. So it was an enormous task. They changed everything, speakers, mics, desks, everything. All the tape machines. I remember they ordered 250 tape machines from one manufacturer. That must have been a happy day for him, I reckon. What a wonderful order. And they were £5,000 each. That was back in 1980. Yeah, so that was quite a nice order. So, it was a remarkable time of change. And at that time, you worked in all the different departments, in drama, in speech studios, and also music studios, because I always loved music studios. So eventually I became the head of the manager, the services manager of the music studios out at Maida Vale and around central London, which was up my street.
And what got you into the loudspeaker design? How did you sort of move into that sphere?
Well, one of the roles I inherited while I was there was the representative for BBC Radio on loudspeaker standards. This was partly to check that the BBC designs were being manufactured by the licensees to the standard that was set by the BBC. I remember back then the BBC didn't think that anybody made any equipment that was good enough for them. We were quite full of our own egos back then. But they had a point. I mean, a lot of speakers, certainly in the 60s, were pretty, they were all right, but they weren't great. So the BBC had its own designs department. It manufactured some of them itself as well. But it licensed them out these designs, and we would test them against references. So I'd go down to Kingswood Warren, where the research department was, and we'd do a lot of A/B listening. And we had lots of technical difficulties. Obviously, sometimes drivers were variable, and we had to either listen to them and measure them, and then in the end, the LS35A, for example, was redesigned because of some of the technical problems with the drive units. So I got into it from that side of it, but then also at the same time, because I was looking after the big music studios where like the John Peel prog was done from, recorded. Radio 1 and 2 had these big studios, and they were using like tannoys and speakers like that, because the BBC speakers wouldn't go loud enough. I mean, in a big recording studio, music studio, you need bulletproof speakers that will produce very high SPLs. So they knew I was into speakers through both my home interest, because I was a big hi-fi enthusiast, and also through the speaker thing. And they said, why don't you try and design basically a big hi-fi speaker that goes incredibly loud, that sounds like a BBC monitor. And that's what started PMC, really. Me and my friend, Adrian Loader, who we both formed PMC together, we spent 3 years, I suppose, while we were at the BBC in our own time, developing what became the BB5, the first speaker that we manufactured. So, and of course, at that point, they turned around to us and said, turned around to me and said, well, you can't work at the BBC and sell to the BBC. So I had to leave. which was looking back, was an incredibly risky thing to do because I had two young children, a big mortgage, and I had one product to sell. So
one customer.
Yeah, one customer. So from a business plan, that probably, if you wrote it down, wouldn't look that impressive.
At least it would have fitted on one piece of paper.
It certainly would, probably half. So very quickly we thought, well, we ought to design something else, and so I designed the LB1, which was the smallest transmission line speaker that had ever been developed. We were very wedded to the transmission line principle. Me and Adrian had both owned IMF transmission lines since the very early 70s. And although they had their faults, we loved the characteristic, there's something magical about the bottom end that we liked. And we felt that, you could develop that technique. Very few people sort of did it then. So we were quite pleased.
For those of the uninitiated listening, do you want to give a 2-minute précis on the transmission line principle and its benefits?
Sure. I suppose the best way to describe it is it's a speaker at the end of a big, long, folded tunnel inside the cabinet. And what that does, it allows the cabinet to control the diaphragm movement. And what it does, it keeps it very, very low. So as you go down in frequency, the distortion is kept very, very even. One of the problems with most speakers is as you go down in frequency, the distortion gets very, very high. There are lots of different techniques to control that. But we found that the transmission line was one that really did reduce distortion a great deal. The real big byproduct of that I love is that because there's low distortion in the bass, the mid-range now blossoms. You get this lovely big image in the room. And that's what really attracted me to it. But of course, the other byproduct of it is that you can get remarkably good low-frequency bass from not too big a cabinet, which is another big plus if you're in the home where you don't want a massive pair of speakers.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a great, that's what drew me to it. Ironically, the only other speaker that I liked years ago were electrostatics, which is, when you think of it, is a completely different design, but it also has very low distortion, and that's why the mid-range sounds so nice. I didn't realise that back then, but that's what they have in similarity. So, the negative, of course, is that they are really complex cabinets to design. So we have very long R&D times to bring them to market. But I think it's worth it because I think the benefits are great, and we're still learning more about them.
Yes, no, and I think the combination of the PMC and the Cyrus amplifiers always seems to work quite well in my view.
Yeah.
And some of that matching can be, you try and design amplifiers that will drive all speakers, but invariably there are some that work better than others.
There are. I mean, one of the nice things about transmission lines as well is it allows us to produce a speaker that's a reasonable load to the amplifier. So it will match your amplifiers better. It's not so demanding. There are a lot of speakers out there that they sound great, but they need some massive, great amplifier to be able to cope with, the way the speaker loads the amplifier. Well, we've never gone down that path.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and in terms of amplifier design, what we're focusing on is obviously trying to produce an amplifier that's got an amazing sort of peak current output, because it's that sudden current drive that these speakers suck up.
Absolutely.
Now, you were telling me the other day, because we've known each other a long time and often stop and have a cup of coffee and other things. And most people would have thought that speaker design hasn't changed much, because when you look at the core technology, it's a code. But actually, underneath the skin, design has come quite a long way. Do you just want to expand on that a little?
Yeah, I suppose, it's like saying, cars have still got a body and four wheels. I mean, yes, speakers are still very similar looking in many ways, but the developments that have happened behind the scenes are quite remarkable. I mean, I think especially computer technologies that accelerated that process, because we're now able to measure things that we wouldn't have had time to. I mean, my son now heads up our R&D team, and they measure things in like 5 minutes with a laser beam and a computer-controlled measuring kit that would have taken me a day to do. So, you can explore things when you're developing a speaker way more. I mean, probably something like quite simple is like a drive unit. One of the problems with drive units is there's lots of bits that are glued together. You've got the little rubber surround, you've got the cone, you've got the dust cap in the middle, and behind it you've got the neck of the voice coil, and all these parts are all glued together. and the type of glue you use changes the sound at every join. Whereas in the old days, you had to keep building all these different prototypes, and it took months, Whereas nowadays, you can model them on computers and get pretty close to it within, 80%. So the speed that you can turn around the design. So developments in drive units is phenomenal. We're measuring cabinets to try and make them vibrate less, so we can measure them with little accelerometers to show how quickly they stop vibrating. There's all sorts of things now you can explore, which you could have done years ago, but it would have taken like 10 years to bring a speaker to market. Meanwhile, you wouldn't have any money.
Yeah.
So you're now, you've got this phenomenal acceleration. You also see in the really inexpensive speakers now, you can go into quite, shops that sell speakers for £100, and they're not bad now. I mean, the work, there are some terrible ones, I know, but some of them are quite remarkable because all that development now is producing better and better performance. And I think for speaker designers, that's a fantastic time, really. It's changing quickly. I think the downside, I think, Simon, is that a lot of people aren't embracing a lot of that, and they're producing speakers that you could have made 40 years ago. And I think that's disappointing because you want to, you might want to drive a car that's 40 years old as a retro, but it doesn't perform anywhere near like a modern car. And that's true of a modern speaker, or it should be.
Yes. Yeah. No, I agree. And there are lots of things out there where it's always listening to the kit or the speaker or the amplifier, whatever it is, that suddenly people realise that, wow, there's been a massive jump in performance since I last went through this exercise. Yeah.
What's really interesting, I mean, at PMC, we've got a museum of speakers, all different manufacturers. We're going to hope to open it at some time so that people can go and see it. But when you listen to them all, I mean, there are some key speakers that still hold up pretty well, but 95% of them don't. You can find those ones that really sound, like the LS35A, that's why that's still popular, because it was so ahead of its time. It's still not bad. I don't think it's up to the standard we can do now, but it still holds its own. But most of those speakers you listen to and you sort of go, well, yeah, things have moved on a lot,
Yeah, they're amazing.
And they're also pretty ugly as well, a lot of them.
It's true. Yes, yeah. And the number of times my wife says, what have you got that in here for? But yeah, we've got a whole nother topic of conversation that. Now, let's just drag this back to vinyl, because obviously that's what this day is all about. I've been looking at your background there, and I'm pretty sure those are records, but because of the perspective, they look a bit sort of CD-like, but they're not. They're vinyl, aren't they? Do you want to get one out just to prove to everyone how many you've got?
Yeah. I'm not quite sure which way round you like me to go, but you can see that these are records.
Wow. So that is, and what percentage of your collection is that in that wall behind you?
It's about well, it comes around the corner, so there's a whole other big raft of them upstairs. That's sort of just over half, I think, probably.
Wow.
You take up a lot of room, speaker. I mean, it's like, and 78s, of course, take up even more room because they've only got 3 minutes on them and they're massive.
Yes.
So at least there's 40 minutes on each of those.
And the interesting thing, of course, because where the word album actually comes from the days of 78s, doesn't it? Because you could only get 3 minutes on each side.
Exactly. If a classical piece of music was released, it had to be released in an album of about sort of 5 to 6 discs to cope with all the, to all the transitions at every 3-4 minutes.
Yeah.
So that's why they were called albums. And I think it's more of an Americanism. I mean, they were. We certainly adopted the word LP much more in the 50s when they came out. But then we've gone a bit American with the album. But that is the original name of them. Like the original reason why we call them albums.
Yeah.
And they weighed a ton, those albums.
Okay, so I think what I'd like to try and wrap up with, Peter, is your favourite piece of vinyl. So we've asked a lot of people throughout the day to select their one album or vinyl of choice, and you've got a particularly special one, I understand.
I have. I bought this record back in 1970 when I was 15. I didn't like it at first. I remember a girlfriend of mine lent it to me and I really didn't like it. And then I went then about 3 months later, I heard it again and bought it. And when I was working at the BBC, they were doing a program about Trident Studios, which is where this album was recorded. And an engineer came in with this reel of tape, and on it were 5 piano demos of the tracks that were released. And the album is Elton John's second album, which was this one. It's called the Elton John album. I don't know if can you see that? Yeah.
Yeah.
People refer to it as the Black Album because if you say it's an Elton John album, it doesn't really narrow it down now. Back then it did because this was only his second LP. Now, this chap at Trident who had these piano demos, I very kindly got a copy of those, and they sat in my archive for the last 40-odd years. And then I had a conversation with Universal Music, who are going to release the 50th anniversary of this album this year, and they were a bit short of one of their piano demos. They didn't have one in their archive, and I had it from this tape back from the 70s.
Wow, amazing.
So that's now going to go on the 50th anniversary edition of the Elton John album, the Black Album, and that's released. Well, it was going to be released on Record Store Day, which of course has been postponed, but it'll come out eventually. And I think we're getting a PMC credit on it for supplying that track.
Oh, amazing. Fantastic. Yeah. Fantastic. So that is your album of choice. Any particular favourite track on that one?
I suppose so. I mean, I quite like The King Must Die. Not a very positive sounding title. I think what I loved about it was quite... the trouble is when you retrospectively look at these albums, you can't often see why on earth they were so big at the time.
Yeah.
But I think what had happened is the Beatles had broken up in '69. There was a whole revolution of changing from bands to singer-songwriters. You know, there was quite a transition around 1970. You know, Joni Mitchell came out, there were Cat Stevens, David Bowie. A lot of singer-songwriters became popular. And Elton John was one of those artists as well. And then Gus Dudgeon, who produced Space Oddity with David Bowie, he was brought in to produce this album. And he did this absolutely wonderful production job on it. And he brought in this young guy, Paul Buckmaster, who did string and orchestral arrangements. And the soundscape that they produce on this album is really quite something. And that was the thing that really hit me. It was quite a different sound then, not now, but back then it was. And they released it in 5.1 about 10 years ago. And that even shows up even more of how remarkable those recordings were back then. And I think it was done on a 16 track. So, and it was done in a few days, you know, it was pretty, they turned them around quick in those days.
Yeah, studio time was expensive then, wasn't it? Of course.
It was huge. And of course, he was an unknown artist. He wasn't, you know, I think it cost £5,000 to make the album, which was quite a lot of money back in 1970. And Dick James of Dick James Music took a bet on it that it would be popular, which was quite a risk. But I think that's what happened back then. Artists were often, allowed to play around with their art for several years before they actually made a return for the record label. Whereas, of course, today people want instant return. So it changes the dynamic of how music is developed or how an artist develops. You know, he or she has got to make a successful record very quickly.
Instant impact, yeah. And I guess given that sort of soundscape on that album, that again is one that really benefits from a good system. You can really see the difference on it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a really nice recording. I have to say, I still think first pressings of the album are probably sounding the best, which is often true of old vinyl. The first pressing often re-releases, the tapes have deteriorated, or maybe they've actually misplaced the original tapes. So it's quite common. I remember going to the studio once and they're actually producing a CD from a cassette copy of an album because all the tapes were missing. So, you know, getting an original vinyl copy, which they're still out there, is probably the best way to hear it and how it's intended to be listened to. Brilliant. I think that's the other thing you've got to realise is that the whole focus, like you were mentioning about the Beatles earlier, you know, those original first albums are all designed to be played in mono. The stereo releases that came later aren't really very successful until you get to Revolver, which were really designed for stereo. And I think that also goes to the medium that they were recorded for. These albums were recorded to be played on vinyl. Nobody had access to anything else. So to me, it probably the whole thing sounds better on that medium.
Yeah, because it was designed for that. Now, I agree. I mean, there are lots of albums that just sound better as albums. And I remember when CDs first came out. I think one of the first CDs I had was one of the Rolling Stones ones that had "Start Me Up" on it, and it just didn't sound the same on the CD. Because it just sounded too brittle, and CDs come a long way, and obviously streaming's come a long way, and now recording techniques have come a long way, and people going to a recording studio knowing it's going to be streamed and it's mastered to work well over that medium. But you're right, it's always good to listen to music on the source for which it was originally created, I think.
I think so, yeah. And as I say, never underestimate the fact that later releases are made from inferior original copies. That's quite common. I mean, the Beatles were very lucky to have EMI because their archive is humidity controlled. They've cherished all their tapes and looked after them, and that's why all these re-releases are available, because they've kept the tapes. Whereas most artists, their record labels have disappeared, and the tapes have got moved around over the decades, and it's very difficult to locate an original master. So it's always been a challenge, I think, for re-releases to find an original tape. And that's just, anyway. Yeah.
Peter, that's been absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed chatting with you again, and some wonderful stories that I hope will lift the spirits of our listeners who are down in their houses. And no doubt when this is all over, we'll be sharing the old cup of coffee again soon.
Oh, definitely. I'll book that coffee. Is that a euphemism for coffee, is it? Might be something strong.
Peter, that's brilliant. Thanks very much. Take care.
Yeah, really good to talk, Simon.
Yeah.
Speak to you soon.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.